Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for your attendance at today's event. My name is Scott Hierman, and I'm the editor of books here at the Omohundro Institute and associate professor of history at William and Mary. I want to introduce our speakers. First up is Dr. Paul Polgar. Dr. Polgar is a former postdoc of the Omohundro Institute, and he began his career at the University of Mississippi, where he was first assistant and then associate professor. Since 2024, he has taught at Tufts University. He is the author of numerous articles on the early national period and, of course, the acclaimed book we're here to discuss today, Standard Bearers of Equality, new out in paperback. Dr. Ronald Angelo Johnson is Ralph and Bessie Mae Lynn Chair of History and Professor of History at Baylor University. Like Paul, he has written extensively on the age of revolutions. In a first book entitled Diplomacy in Black and White, John Adams, Toussaint Louverture, and their Atlantic World Alliance. And, of course, he is the author of the very recent, and dare I say very excellent book, Entangled Alliances, Racialized Freedom and Atlantic Diplomacy During the Age of Revolution. Paul, Ron, welcome. So I want to open up our discussion today by asking about the present, which in some way, shape, or form always informs how we engage with the past. On the republication of your book, Paul, what are your hopes for it and how it will continue to shape our understanding of early America? And Ron, same question. What did you set out to accomplish in publishing this book now instead of pursuing all of the many other projects that you are pursuing?
Thank you, Scott, for that introduction. And thank you to the Omohundro Institute for hosting this conversation. Really looking forward to the discussion. Yeah, reflecting on this paperback publication of my book, I was sort of thinking about what I had set out to accomplish, right? So when I first developed this project, at this point, years and years ago, um, I had sort of set out to recast what had been considered sort of early American abolitionism. There was a lot written on, key figures, both enslaved and free people of color and leading, Quaker abolitionists and some sort of key figures, as well as these abolition societies that I profile. But there wasn't sort of a larger sort of argument for a coherent, organized movement. My sort of loftiest ambitions for the book was to sort of make this case for what I call first movement abolitionism, this kind of coherent organizational, strategic, and ideological movement looking to both end slavery and to incorporate free people into the Republic as equal citizens, to sort of put that movement onto the larger timeline of abolition and emancipation in the same way as immediate abolitionists, where, the traditional narrative of abolitionism tends to begin. Um, have I, recast the entire timeline? Probably not, but I do think that in sort of looking back, that I have established within the literature, sort of taking, what had been considered a set of actors that were like not necessarily fully kind of mobilized and organized as a larger movement. I do think that I've sort of put that on the map. And so that scholars that are looking to, sort of write and research on abolitionism before 1830s are engaging with my work. The other thing, I guess, I'll say for now is I think my larger goal also was to really emphasize contest over consensus when it came to issues of race, of rights, and of reform over, slavery, anti-slavery, the early republic prior to 1830. And that is to sort of bring into conversation both these abolitionist protagonists, but also, those pro-slavery forces, also the American Colonization Society, which, did not have that same reform program as first movement abolitionists, and in fact, looked towards exclusion for free people of color as part of their anti-slavery formula. So to sort of show that, kind of contest over how is this new nation going to define race and rights, and to kind of put that on the same kind of plane as, politically, how will we define this new nation in the years after American independence when it comes to, interpreting, say, the U.S. Constitution, to sort of have that equivalent, but for race, rights, and reform. And, So that sort of was another kind of larger methodological intervention and framing. And I think for the most part, my book has been interpreted that way. So let me turn over to Ron.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And Scott, thank you so much for the question around how does my work fit into today. To all of our listeners and our colleagues online here today, I wanted to start out with a confession. Entangled Alliances was not the book that I started out to write when I began this project 3 years ago. I had proposed a much larger, grander book that went for years and years and years and beyond. But what I found when I was doing the writing is that the relationship between the United States and Saint-Domingue, which is later going to become Haiti, but the United States and Saint-Domingue during the American Revolution in American history circles has not really been explored, I think, in the way that I eventually did in the book. And that is one of the things that led me to write about multiracial founders, both in the United States and in Saint-Domingue, working toward these ideals of freedom, ideals of liberty, ideals of equality, words that we kind of throw around. What I found was people in the United States, both black and white, people in Saint-Domingue, both black and white, grappling with these in connected ways, but also divergent ways. And I just found that wonderful synergy that was occurring that I had not read anywhere else. And so it was a real pleasure to bring together these two stories. But I say pleasure on one hand, but trying to write in a U.S. history that introduced my readers to people they've not heard of, to places in Saint-Domingue like the Limbe Valley, Jacmel, Jérémie. It really put a burden upon me as the writer to do my best to bring my readers to those places, as opposed to thinking that my readers would have that knowledge at the ready. And so it was a pleasure, but it was also a challenge. And I will leave it up to my readers to say how well I did on that front. In terms of the present, I had no idea the conversations we would be having in 2026 around the importance of Black people to the American story. I had no idea the ways in which identities would be questioned and the value of certain human beings within our society would be questioned. And I think that one of the things that my book does is that for everyone who encounters my book, I hope that they will see that the founding of the United States, the ideals of freedom, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. War of Independence, those were interconnected efforts by both Black and white people here in the United States, but also with people around the Atlantic world. And I hope that in these present conversations, my work will at least give value to certain individuals and groups whose existence and whose importance to our history and our present are being called into question. That is what I hope. That's not what I set out to do, but I do hope that my work has something to say of value about that. And while I still have the floor, Paul, let me just share with our listeners. I love your book, and I'm so thrilled that it is going into paperback versions. My congratulations to you on that. That's a huge milestone for any author. And I can still remember where I was when I encountered your book. I remember the sun coming through the window because it was such a moment for me, Paul, because I knew in that moment when I was reading this book, I was reading a game changer. And I will let you speak to how it changed the game, but just for a moment, it changed me. This book, your book, changed me as a teacher first and foremost, because teaching the U.S. History Survey, I remember distinctly before your book, I would use the word anti-slavery in terms of people who were opposed to slavery up until the 1830s, right? And then I would jump into the traditional narrative of abolitionism up to the Civil War. What your book empowered me to do was to begin to talk about abolitionism much earlier in the course and to show my students that this desire to eradicate slavery from the United States had been with us as a nation for much longer than we previously had talked about. And I will say also, there's no way for you to know this, but as the editor of the Journal of the Early Republic, I have seen your work. I have seen manuscripts come in that are building on this book. And so I'm gonna ask you now, when Standard Bearers of Equality first came out, and you had this proposition, as you described earlier, of first movement of abolitionism, it was fresh and innovative and bold. How would you, as the author, describe the reception of your intervention into the historical literature by readers, students, and colleagues?
Yeah, well, first of all, Ron, thank you very much for those very kind words. It's really great to hear about that impact. Soon get to asking you questions about your book, and I really certainly found that extremely dynamic and game-changing as well. Um, but yes, I think there's different ways to measure impact. I mean, you mentioned certainly having an insider's view, having been the editor of the Journal of the Republic for a long time, that certainly just knowing that scholars are, having to sort of account for your interpretation, put themselves in conversation with it, um, I think is always a sign that something is sort of tracking right with broader scholarship. And certainly teaching. It's sort of great to hear you say that as well, because, so much going on when I was conceiving this project, right, is to sort of bring to light and I think recover the stories and perspectives of those that, I sort of argue were part of this larger first movement abolitionist coalition. And in acknowledging that, right, the next step then is to sort of change that timeline of abolitionism. Because as you said, and the terminology is completely right, the dominant narrative has been, right, and had been to, sort of see opposition to slavery, right, prior to the 1830s, even just sort of in the language often as anti-slavery, is this kind of loose often individualistic opposition to slavery, right? And or the kind of the first organizational presence that was really strong was seen as the American Colonization Society, which of course my book argues was in fact really an apostasy against, right, everything that first movement abolitionists stood for in terms of free black incorporation and citizenship being completely attendant with and totally enmeshed within their larger program of reform. Colonization says, the opposite. In order to end slavery, right, you literally have to physically exclude freed people from, the very boundaries of the American Republic. So, yeah, I mean, I do think that, narratively, right, it's always really hard to measure exactly how, your book is sort of upending, right, really sort of large and overarching interpretations. But I do think that it's made an impact in that way, and it's great to hear that. I will say also, though, the other way that you sort of know that it's making a mark is when you have those that are pushing against, right? I mean, in a sense, as you know, right, Ron, that's sort of like the greatest compliment, right, is when someone actually is trying to tear down your interpretation. So I have seen a little bit of that also taking shape, and it sort of made me smile because I know when I first started out, a book that I still really respect and that had, been sort of the sort of dominant interpretation of abolitionism before 1830, and is still really important, is Richard Newman's Transformation of American Abolitionism. And that book was so important for me, both as sort of a resource, but also as, sort of a larger kind of dominant interpretation that I wanted to push back against, right? And so in a lot of ways, sort of seeing that beginning to happen to standard bearers is really the greatest compliment, and it has been really great to see scholars see worth arguing over, right, and to sort of grapple with. But I wanted to talk a little bit more. I mean, Ron, you mentioned some of this already, but I just wanted to say how dynamic, how exciting your book is, and how it's so timely, obviously, right? With the sesquicentennial of the American Revolution, and it's just to me the strongest argument, right, for seeing the revolution as a transatlantic story and sort of pushing back against this kind of proto-nationalist understanding of the revolution. And also, it's just so fluid the way you bring in, right, these non-North American geographies and actors and this sort of array of elites and more marginalized people and people of color, along with elite diplomats. And so I'm sort of curious if we're thinking broadly, right? Because you were asking about impact with my book, which obviously is being reissued as a paperback after having been out for a while. But your book is this, baby, right? Brand new. Um, so I'm curious what sort of you're taking in terms of what your hopes and expectations are for how you see your book sort of reshaping how we understand, I would say, the revolution writ large, but really more sort of also kind of how slavery and freedom um, is, part of that process within the larger revolutionary Atlantic. Like, how does that shift when we, take away this kind of like proto-nationalist framework?
First of all, that's a really great question, Paul. And I really, one of the things I wanted to do was situate the United States and the American Revolution in the Atlantic world neighborhood. I really wanted my readers to come away understanding that the United States was a neighbor. It was surrounded by other people dealing with very similar issues that were being dealt with in North America, from New Hampshire down to Georgia. And I begin the book rather in a very unusual way. I think this is probably one of the first books on the American Revolution that begins in the Caribbean. I open the book in the Limbe Valley with a community of formerly enslaved people who have freed themselves by running away or walking off or creating what we call maroon communities. And I did that intentionally so that I can introduce my readers to the idea up front that the ideals of liberty and freedom did not begin in Philadelphia. As important as Philadelphia was and remains to the national American story, people were grappling with freedom and liberty across the Atlantic world. And the Americans are going to join in that conversation, but they didn't start it. And I wanted, and I wanted my readers to begin there, but also I want my readers to come away with the idea that slavery, talking about slavery in US history, is not an abomination. It is not demeaning the United States to talk about slavery, but what I hope my book does is demonstrate how important the question of slavery was to the kind of nation the United States was going to become. And just like freedom and the ideal of freedom did not start in the United States, slavery did not start in the United States, and the United States was not the only place dealing with that. And so I want my readers to understand that as Americans were grappling with the question of freedom and slavery, so also was Saint Domingue and other Caribbean colonies. That question of slavery, emancipation, freedom, republic, these questions were interrelated. And there is a reason that we struggle talking about slavery and racism today. And it's because those issues were and remain hard. In that room in Philadelphia were some of the brightest minds at the time and that the United States has ever produced, and they couldn't come up with a solution. And so I want my readers to really understand that the reason we continue to grapple is that those questions were hard. And even the Declaration of Independence couldn't solve the problem. Even the Constitution couldn't solve the problem, right? And then we have a generation of people that you talk about who come in and like have another solution to the problem. So that's what I wanted my readers to come away with. What was happening in North America was in some ways mirroring what was happening around them. And so the United States was being influenced and influencing its Atlantic world neighbors. That's what I set out to do. And again, I hope my readers will write in and let me know how well I did that. And as you talked about, my book is a baby, right? My book's been out for around 6 months now. Yours is seven, Paul. It's been 7 years. I mean, seven. I mean, like, wow, man. And so here's the question I just kind of want to throw at you for a minute. In that 7 years, since you got that first, you remember when you unboxed this book the first time, right? Since that moment, how do you feel you have changed as an author and a teacher around the subject of abolitionism in the early United States?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Ron, because we think about how when we publish, it's on the one hand the kind of culmination, right? The history monographs, right, or books of years and years of work. And then it sort of becomes that culmination becomes sort of emblematic of a moment in time, right? In a sense, frozen in time in that way. And yet, of course, we're as living people changing. And so I love that question. And it's really interesting because I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I would say that so much of what we do when we write, right, and we enter a larger historical conversation and we publish is we're in, of course, conversations with other interpretations. And we find, sort of niches for ourselves, right? Sort of what kind of needs to be told, right? Whose voices need to be heard, like how do interpretations need to shift based on what I'm seeing with the sources, both primary and secondary. And so for me, as I think I've, alluded to, right, that project, that book was so driven by, demonstrating this coherent, cohesive, and really provocative, right, and challenging movement, I argued, geared at both slavery and racial inequality. And so at the time, right, so much of my work, both the research and the writing, was geared towards establishing that, right? And I've talked about how I think a lot of that has worked out in terms of making that impact. But now looking back, I think that, I sort of teach and think about and even talk about the book more in terms of even more, not that I don't cover this in the book, but I would say lean into it more, the kind of ambiguities, right? The kind of limits in a sense, a kind of grounded sense of what first movement abolitionists could and couldn't accomplish. Um, the tensions, the limits, right? The other thing about this project, right, is it was taking shape at a much more optimistic time. Again, because, it was published in 2019, but as I mentioned, it takes years and years. And this was originally like a dissertation, so this went way back. And of course, and Ron's been alluding to this, right? Our current socio-political moment is very different and in a lot of ways much less optimistic. So I think when you sort of overlay the present and then also the ways in which, right, the book was trying to sort of respond to, right, and make this argument for this coherent, confident movement, I now sort of, see more measured the kind of optimism that first movement abolitionists, it was so essential for them. It was essential for them to imagine a different society, one wherein, right, white prejudice and racism could be overcome. But of course, that program that they adopt, both the abolition societies along with a lot of sort of the free black community leader allies, right, of course, is shaped by class assumptions, right? Certainly paternalism, which I, acknowledge in the book, right, helps to sort of create a hierarchical, right, top-down approach. And it's one also that's quite defensive, right? Because first movement abolitionists are responding to, right, the arguments of slavery's defenders, which is to say, small r Republican citizenship, right, that ideal of virtuous citizenship is something that free people of color, right, have to prove, right? So the onus is on them. So right there, that in a sense, or not in a sense, it's defensive, right? Um, and then also I'll just say that I lean more into kind of the kind of ambiguities of revolutionary ideology itself, right? Again, something I acknowledge in the book, but I think is just so important, and certainly in the way I teach it, the ways in which sort of natural rights ideology, right, and the potential for expanding that and kind of the politicization of slavery that makes abolitionism as a movement possible, right? That makes possible a gradual emancipation process in, the northern states also, of course, emphasizes property rights. Also results in slavery's defenders moving towards race as a way to say, well, if equal citizenship and or this idea of sort of the people at large being ultimately sovereign is the idea. Well, here's why, right? People of color and enslaved people can't fit that mold, right? And so those kind of ambiguities are something that I really sort of lean into and reference a lot more in the way I sort of think about it now. But again, that was only made possible because I feel like I was able to establish how this movement was, really coherent and confident. Um, so Ron, I like hearing you talk about your books. Like one thing that I, found one of the many things that I found really exciting about it was, and you sort of referenced this, but I want to draw this out a little bit more with actors is some of these actors that you are showcasing, and this goes to sort of like who we're including and who we're talking about, right, in the revolutionary age, who sort of are being showcased in ways that they weren't before. So I was hoping that you could talk a bit about one figure that probably no one in this event has heard of, right? Francois Macandal, I believe, right? A Haiti fascinating figure, right? But also Crispus Attucks. I think you do some really fascinating work with him. Prince Hall. So can you speak a bit about what you do with those figures and why they're important and why you sort of add them to the narrative?
I love that question. And what one of the things that I hope that I did here. Well, let me back up for one moment. I still see the history of the American Revolution as written as a segregated revolution, right? There are books on the, I guess we would call it the traditional narrative of the American Revolution. And then there are women in the revolution, there are African Americans in the revolution, and there are different actors. And I'm glad we need all that scholarship, and I want more of it. But what I don't want is for American reading public to say, I want to know about the real revolution, so I'm going to grab these certain ones. And if I'm inclined and I want to know about Black people, I'm going to go grab this book. What I try to do in this book is show that women, African Americans, you can't separate them out. They are part and parcel of each other, right? And so in the book, I really do try to weave the lives of Black people right in alongside the lives of white people. And again, I start off with Francois Macandal, right? That's who I start with. And again, there are very few U.S. history readers who would have heard about him or known about him. His quote unquote, and I put this in quotes for all the readers. You can decide what you want to do with the word, but his insurrection, right, was prosecuted in 1758. Right, that's really early. It's 5 years before the Treaty of Paris, 5 years before the end of the 7 Years' War. But I begin with him because he embodies freedom. He embodies the idea of what it meant to be free because he was born in Africa, enslaved in Saint Domingue, literally walked off the plantation one day and went to live in a maroon community for 2 decades. Then he comes back in a Harriet Tubman style. I'm putting Harriet Tubman there for my U.S. readers can grab onto. He goes back to enslaved people and he empowers them not to run away, but to be free within themselves on the plantation, right? In this way, and the plantation owners, the pro-slavery authorities found that to be detrimental to the system, and they persecuted him. And I'll leave it there for the readers. I don't want to tell the whole story, but I thought it was important to introduce my readers to what other people were doing to be free. Crispus Attucks, right? I'm glad you brought him up. I really found his story fascinating. When we say Crispus Attucks, there are a lot of people, oh, I've heard of Crispus Attucks. He's not really new. What is new in this book is that most of us encounter Crispus Attucks through that picture of the Boston Massacre on March 5th, 1770. He's lying dead in that picture. And so we learn about him at his death, right? Well, in my book, where I try to introduce and tell my readers about is the life he lived as first an enslaved man, but then 2 decades before the Boston Massacre, He, like Mackinac, walked off the plantation, gained his freedom, and lived as a free man for 2 decades, right? And then he ends up dying as part of the American Revolution. And I wanted my readers to see Black people as freedom seekers, as people who embody freedom, and people who had real lived experiences, right? I mean, there's this one part in the book where Phyllis Wheatley, right, the enslaved poet Phyllis Wheatley, and we've heard about her. But what I found so fascinating is that she writes a poem for in honor of George Washington, and she sends him a letter and the poem, and then George Washington writes back to her. They have a dialogue with each other, and he invites her to come and visit him in person. And I think those stories, Paul, for me, those stories are important because, again, it reminds us that even George Washington, who was a slaveholder, could see value and personhood in a formerly enslaved person. She's free by the time she sends that letter to him. But in addition, throughout the book, I put the life of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who is an enslaved man in Saint-Domingue. He's going to become the leader of the independent country of Haiti 30 years later. But I put his life alongside that of a young Alexander Hamilton, who was living in the Caribbean. So they're both teenagers at the same time. One is an enslaved teenager in Saint Domingue. Another is a poor white teenager working in a merchant shop in St. Croix. And again, I want my readers to come away with seeing common humanity across the lives of the people I write about. And that was a big goal for me in the book. And again, I hope I did a good job with that because I really did try to honor the lived experiences of those. And just one last thing I'll say about this is throughout my book, my readers will be introduced to fugitive freedom seekers who appear in newspapers, and all we have is their first name and a physical description. But to recover them and to put their lives in the story, I made a concerted effort to put as much as I had on them because that little bit that we have is important because they were much more than that, but that's all we have, and I think we should remember them in that way. And that this question actually leads me to one that I had for you, Paul, because throughout your book you highlight the voices and the contributions of free Black persons to the first movement abolitionism in the United States. I mean, there are some names, right? There are some names that those of us who studied the field are going to be familiar with. But for more casual readers, who are some of the Black abolitionists that you would like them to learn about as they read through your book?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, Ron. And I think it's a good way to put our books into direct conversation because I certainly felt this is sort of chapter two where I showcase how the abolition societies, along with enslaved and free people of color on the ground, are actually making this abolitionist program something tangible in enforcing and expanding freedom. And so, one of the really eye-opening things to me about research and writing the book was sort of broadening how we think about who counts as an abolitionist, right? Now, certainly there are, and maybe I'll talk a bit about Peter Williams Jr., but there are, sort of it's really essential early American Black abolitionists. I think like Richard Allen, who, founds the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Absalom Jones, the list goes on. But to me, actually, some of the most poignant sort of research that I was doing was sort of investigating this kind of caseload of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and the New York Manumission Society that have these minutes that are sort of detailing the ways in which they are often responding to those who are being held often illegally in slavery and or have their freedom directly threatened and are actively coming to these societies in asserting their freedom and then working with them. And so in that way, right, these sort of what we call like, these are not formal actors, right, or formal sort of activists. They're sort of like everyday Black men and women who are acting as abolitionists on the ground, right? Almost like sort of the vanguard. So just, really briefly, like the second chapter opens up with and this actually brings the Atlantic element too. Lewis Martin, who is brought as an enslaved man from Curacao, and in 1801, I believe, and at that time, sort of New York hasn't, adopted a gradual emancipation law, but has or has these other laws that they have, sort of, that are, sort of allowing Black freedom to be asserted beyond just gradual emancipation statutes themselves. So there's one statute that says that any enslaved person brought into the state cannot be taken out of the state for sale. And so Lewis Martin is sold and he's going to be brought to Philadelphia, but he comes to the New York Manumission Society, brings his case, and he, in doing that, is almost certainly tapping into free Black communities and networks that are, he's looking to as a resource, and that then he is sort of learning that there's actually a pathway, right, to assert that freedom that wouldn't have been possible without these laws, and in acting right together with these abolition societies, right, actively navigating this system. And so there are just manifold cases like this. And like some of the kind of breathtaking moments here in research and writing this book was going through this caseload where you would sort of see these stories introduced, you sort of hold your breath to see what would happen. There were certainly plenty of stories of tragedy where these individuals aren't able to assert their freedom. But there's also these really poignant stories where there's agency, autonomy, and then just sort of that really transcendent assertion of freedom that's worked out. So I would say that it certainly was to me sort of broadening that framework, right, for these individuals and bringing their stories out. But I will also showcase prominent free Black leaders within these kind of burgeoning communities. And I focus in the mid-Atlantic cities of New York and Philadelphia. So in New York, Peter Williams Jr. is really a fascinating figure. I'm sure, Ron, yes, you know him because he's involved in the early 1800s with free Black migration efforts to Haiti. So he's a student in the New York Manumission, what's called the African Free School. And so he's part of the sort of larger ideological approach of first movement abolitionism. At the same time, he, lives long enough where he also, and this is a big part of my account, right, of the book, sort of sees the arc of reform, mainstream white abolitionist reform, as turning against the sort of hopes and optimism of first movement abolition. And he has this sort of letter that he writes these abolition societies in the early 1800s, just brimming with optimism and confidence that I think he says the rights of Black men and white will be equal. There'll be no difference. That's his expectation. Then by 1830s, in organizing against the American Colonization Society, it's much darker, and you can sort of feel that, right? So that works against this kind of linearity that we often have with abolitionism, where there's, the American Colonization Society movement, which is looking for, exclusion as a solution to anti-slavery, if it's anti-slavery at all, and then immediate abolitionists emerge, and they're asserting, right, that slavery needs to end immediately, and that, Black people should be, equal citizens. But in fact, it doesn't move linearly. And so Peter Williams Jr. is sort of a great example of that, and he's also a praise. I think he's the second ordained Black minister in the United States, and he leads an Episcopal church in New York.
Oh, yeah, you just reminded you've spoken a number of times about optimism, right? About optimism in the time that you were researching and writing the book, optimism in the moment that in the 1700s when this is happening. And that leads me to, and there's no way I want us to end this without introducing this part, because I found it really, there's a poignant section at the end of your book that kind of speaks to this in a certain way. And I want to read part of it for the list for our listeners, and then I want to have you respond to it. You write near the end of the book, although they came up short in achieving equality for people of color, the most enduring legacy of America's first abolition movement was its abiding faith that a world free from Black oppression and equality was possible. What does it mean for you to revisit those words? And what would you like readers to take away from those words when they come to the end of the book?
Yeah, thank you for that, Ron. It's a really thoughtful question. And, I can't help but, and I'm sure you can't either, think about the kind of larger kind of socio-political parallels with today. Um, so, I mean, I think that this was really essential, the kind of like heartbeat of first movement abolitionism was this sense of optimism, right? Because we have to think about all that they were up against, right? This was not a movement that attracted, the masses, right? And it was a movement that was, gradual emancipation in the North. We're not even talking about, right, the southern states. The northern states were, for example, New York and Pennsylvania, slavery is an important institution, but it's not central in the same way as it is further south. And yet here, right, emancipation is gradual, it's contested, right? Of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's this sort of growing race-based ideology, right, that is challenging, right, the sort of more universalist, right, expansion of rights and arguments that abolitionists are making. Right, there's just so many barriers that these abolitionists face. The socioeconomic barricades that free Black communities faced as they're growing, right, and they're nurturing themselves in freedom through churches, through mutual aid societies. And so there's a way in which I really sort of admired that sense of optimism, right? It's that idea of imagining something different in that way. And I think that, first of all, certainly, plenty was accomplished, everything from the first abolition movement, everything from, individuals like, as I mentioned, Lewis Martin in gaining freedom to helping to enact gradual emancipation laws, to helping to sort of nurture these free Black community development, all of these things. But also, I would say just sort of that larger philosophy of they use the term without distinction of color. And we see that in this Pennsylvania Abolition Society petition in 1790 that is submitted to the first Congress over slavery, arguing that the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, we the people, should apply without distinction of color. And we see that same language in the 1860s with radical Republicans and their allies. This idea that rights should not be determined along lines of race. And so I do think that sort of value and that sense of sort of shearing those barricades to rights and citizenship was something that endured. And just the last thing I'll say though is that I think that as I mentioned, that optimism that I admired in the face of the barricades that the first movement abolitionists face, right? At a time where it would have been much easier to sort of say, there's just no way, right? We're going to get these gains we want, right? That's exactly when you have to imagine, right? That's exactly when you have to organize, push for change, imagine something different. And so in sort of thinking about the book, I do think that there are some lessons today that it's exactly at those moments that we need to, right, or reformers, and I think those who, have that kind of value set, right, need to push. Yeah, and so thank you for that question. I don't know how we are on time. I certainly have plenty more things to ask Ron.
Apologies for jumping in, but I'll just read it out loud. Dr. Johnson, you had spoken about bringing readers to other places, especially in Saint-Domingue, and placing the U.S. within an Atlantic context. As someone who studies the ties between the United States and Haiti post-independence, especially as they pertain to the Civil War, what are the best ways I can try to bring readers to these places and contexts in my own work, and to thoughtfully engage readers with the information rather than pushing them away, especially as attitudes towards slavery in independent Haiti seem to harshen during the antebellum period and in modern day?
Well, first of all, that is a really, really wonderful question, and I thank you for it. One of the ways that I did it, because I dealt with very similar issues, right? We're dealing with slavery, we're dealing with race. How was I going to help American readers see what I was seeing? And so one of the things that I did, without excluding the detriments of race and racism and racialized laws, which I write about, I really tried to bring to the fore the idea. I brought something to the fore that I think a lot of American readers don't know about. And that was a year before the Boston Massacre, a multiracial rebellion breaks out on Saint Domingue. And they are fighting against the French king, both white and black people, right? The reason I thought that was important to introduce my readers to that is to show them that even before Lexington and Concord, a rebellion had broken out in Saint Domingue. And so there are connections between these two nations. And also for the questioner, we're also, you and others are also up against what people see of Haiti in the 21st century, right? It is so hard for the American mind to see these two nations as neighbors, as the same, and at one point, depending upon one another. And so I think the more we can do to show the many, many connections between our two nations, the easier it will be to have those harder conversations about the intransigence of slavery, the intransigence of racism, because the connections are there. They don't go away. Throughout the 19th century, Boston is still trading with Haiti throughout, right? There's no relationships, but there are cultural exchanges, there are economic exchanges, there are these quasi diplomatic exchanges, and I think the more we bring those connections out, it will make those other harder conversations more palpable. That's the way I approach it. I hope something in that is helpful.
I'm going to chime in with one for both of you. And it's to pick up on something that you both talked about. I think one of the great accomplishments of your book is to just broaden what we mean by abolitionism, what we mean by anti-slavery, right? That it is, and I think many of us, and I'm speaking for myself personally, can understand that, passing a law, winning a war, declaring a nation, amending a constitution, declaring a principle, right? Okay, these are big moments of change that we can get our heads around. But the sort of local contestations, the sort of quiet conversations, the organizing that doesn't necessarily leave a paper trail, or if it does, hasn't made it into an archive, right? That was abolition too, right? That it was every day, that it was ambient, right? Can you talk a little bit in the classroom of how you walk students through the connection between abolition is at one level, which I think is many of us can get our heads around, right? And abolition at another level, which again, speaking personally, it can be a little difficult to get our hands around. Like, how do you, what's the path of stones that gets us from one to the other?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Scott, and there's different ways to answer it. I mean, I'll stick to this is the Omohundro Institute and only goes to 1820 or 30 theoretically, so technically. So I won't talk about Reconstruction. I was just teaching this and thinking about, the lines between the Civil Rights Act, the 14th and 15th Amendment, and then, what's on the ground in the Reconstructed South. But I guess it is really interesting because I think about these connective threads, and maybe I can just sort of gesture to just to make it tangible, right? That petition I had mentioned, right? So in 1790, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, this petition, technically the signature is Benjamin Franklin. He's mostly a figurehead at this point. He's going to die months later in 1790. But they submit this petition, and again, it has that language that I think really gets at the heart of what this movement was about, without distinction of color. But then within that larger petition, they're really asking the federal government to, as I say, step to the very verge of their powers, right? To, on the one hand, certainly, stop the international involvement as much as possible with the international slave trade, um, and to sort of encourage the larger principles and values of first movement abolitionism. And then this sets off this like fiery debate in Congress, right, over, jurisdiction over slavery, federal versus sort of state power, questions of when to intervene in what ways in the international slave trade. And so, what are sort of these principles that have taken root? And I think, Scott, you said it well, and it gestures back to what I was saying about, first movement abolitionism on the ground and these like really remarkable stories of individuals like asserting dignity, asserting the right to freedom, right? That's where these principles come out of. But then they can also sort of echo and be given a voice at times on the broader sort of national level. So I like to use that petition in the classroom as sort of a way into kind of joining up with the national, the political, the legislative, and the kind of on the ground organizational.
That's great. And before you go, Ron, I just want to say, just because Paul mentioned the sources, we have a great question in the chat here about great sources for teaching as well. So if you might give an
Yeah,
idea.
actually, that's
So
actually
sorry to
what I was
interrupt.
going to respond to that because I did something in the book. I actually taught myself something in the book that I now use in the classroom. In the book, I use newspapers from across the North America, from across the Caribbean, and part of this is digitization allows me to do that, right? Digitization of newspapers and the greater access to them. But I take newspapers from St. Croix, from New York City, Philadelphia, Charleston, Cape Francais, and Saint Domingue, and I put them on the board. And what I show is these freedom seekers, these people that, because in just about any newspaper across the United States, across the Caribbean, freedom seekers are leaving. And St. Croix is a small little island. So you can't like hide. You can't have a maroon community in St. Croix. So what you do in St. Croix is you get on a boat and you sail to Puerto Rico. In Saint Domingue, you have these descriptions of women leaving the plantation with the ball and chain still on them. Sometimes you have two or three people chained together leaving. And so what we see is these unofficial, these informal ways of saying, I am going to be free. While they're talking in Philadelphia, I'm leaving. And that is happening all across the Atlantic world. It's not just the United States. It's not just Korea. And these are interconnected people who don't know each other. But what they give us is a record of people who were never going to be enslaved, who were never going to bow to the overwhelming system. And it's what Paul was talking about, it's that resilience that in the midst of this melancholy, I still have hope that I'm going to get on a boat, which I'd never been on a boat before, at least until I was brought here. I'm going to get on a boat, go to some place called Puerto Rico that I've never been to. I'm going to leave my plantation in Georgia, go to some place I've never heard of, and I that's the way, and that's the idea of slavery, the idea of freedom and emancipation. It has always been there. It doesn't just happen at the Civil War or the big moments. Emancipation is a part of the story from beginning to end, even when it's not in the law.
Well, I can hardly think of a better note to end on as we come up on time here. So very well said. So I want to again thank you all for your attendance. I want to thank Paul and Ron for this great conversation and to commend them on writing two excellent books. And I want to welcome you all to continue to follow us at the Omohundro Institute. Pay attention. We'll be having online programming and events all summer and then again into the fall. And I hope you'll come back out and join in the conversation. I'm sure they'll be every bit as illuminating as this one was today. Thank you.